When Sega ended the Dreamcast, most people assumed that was the end. Another console gone, another company defeated. But that's not actually what happened. The Dreamcast didn't end, it moved. And I could sit here and explain to you what the Dreamcast was. And I could give you a detailed list of its specs, a laundry list of games that helped it stand out during the console wars. I could even talk about how ahead of its time it was because it had a built-in 56K modem and it had 480p output at 60 FPS. Sega honestly had a hold my beer mentality with their ideas. I could start off with that, but would it actually tell you what the Dreamcast was? The reality is the Dreamcast wasn't just some box full of hardware, nuts and bolts. It wasn't just a console, it was a system of incentives. When I say system of incentives, I don't mean some corporate buzzword. What I mean to say is that every console quietly rewards certain kind of games. Some make it easier for big cinematic blockbusters to succeed, and some reward weird and experimental games. That reward system is what I call incentives. First and foremost, the Dreamcast had three important factors: the development culture, the genre ecosystem, and its risk factor. The development culture that surrounded the Dreamcast was built around fast iteration, arcade sensibilities, and most importantly, developer freedom. They didn't focus on blockbusters or cinematic realism. And if you wanted that, Sony's PlayStation was typically where you'd find it. It rewarded short replayable gameplay loops, mechanical novelty, experimental multiplayer, rhythm concepts, and most importantly, arcade to home translation. Sega was an arcade company first and foremost, and as any Yakuza fan knows, they had their own proprietary arcades all across Japan. Sega's then leadership explicitly positioned the Dreamcast as a way to bring their arcade business into the homes of their consumers. Sega's internal studios, AM2, Smilebit, and United Game Artists, were arcade teams first and console teams second. This is also why the Dreamcast launch titles included games like Crazy Taxi, Soul Calibur, and Power Stone. With games like these, Sega weren't really asking gamers to settle in. They were asking gamers to jump in, throw hands, race cars. It also helped that the console intentionally lowered the barrier to development, utilizing GD-ROM and having relative PC-like architecture. It had familiar APIs compared to, say, the PlayStation 1 or the Nintendo 64. And Microsoft and Sega jointly promoted this angle, stating, "The Dreamcast will offer developers a familiar development environment based on Windows CE and DirectX technologies." Also, notice how I mentioned Microsoft there. Just keep that in mind for later because it's actually going to be pretty important. The genre ecosystem that the Dreamcast had was a safe harbor for games that didn't fit into PlayStation's prestige model. It was a haven for niche games. And not niche because they were bad, but because they were just odd. You got a mixed bag of rhythm games, arcade racers, experimental multiplayer, stylized action games, and even social/local co-op experiences. These types of games cluster when platform holders tolerate risk and because developers follow permissions, hardware supporting quick iteration, and an audience that expects novelty. Historically, the Dreamcast gained a reputation for experimental and arcade-style titles that were just too difficult to market on other systems. Games like Jet Set Radio, Rez, Seaman, and Space Channel 5 were pretty far from technical showcases. They were more like conceptual showcases. They weren't games that were designed to sell consoles. They were designed because the developer wanted to try something new. In this regard, the library was less of a list of games and more of an ecosystem. Self-contained niche titles existing inside of a niche console. Sort of like the Dreamcast was a terrarium. Tetsuya Mizuguchi of United Games Artists repeatedly described the Dreamcast as a rare environment where concept-driven games could and would often get approved, saying, quote, "Dreamcast allowed us to create something that just didn't exist before." This, of course, came with its own issues. Typically, investors don't want to gamble investments on risk. When it came to risk factor, the Dreamcast had a high tolerance for failure, structurally and culturally. This was born from Sega's financial position at the time, which wasn't really ideal, but more necessity. Its arcade heritage, lower relative development costs, and a desperate need to differentiate from everything else at the time. Nintendo was appealing to the younger demographic, and Sony was appealing to the older demographic. Therefore, Sega had to claw their way into the market and position themselves against two titans duking it out. Despite this though, Sega was horribly losing the hardware war, and eventually, that kind of imbalance always resolves itself. In the end, they were forced to differentiate through software identity. Sega would ultimately lose the war, and the Dreamcast would dissolve. thus leaving this conceptual and experimental ecosystem in a fragile and vulnerable state. Though the hardware was now gone, the ideas and the games still lived on. On January 31st, 2001, Sega would go on to do something unthinkable by today's standards. They announced their departure from hardware and decided to focus on producing games instead. This meant that their ideas would live on, just no longer on their home turf. In other words, they stopped building the terrarium and instead started focusing on the things that would go into the terrarium. Financially, this was a good decision. Manufacturing a console is expensive, like really expensive. And it's especially expensive if you're not selling that console well. With this move, they no longer had to worry about the cost of hardware. Software was much cheaper in comparison. With the platform now dead, its orphan ecosystem needed to find a new place to survive. The devs needed to migrate, and with that, their ideas needed to migrate with them. There was now a vacuum, an open space in the market that needed filling. And in the world of console marketing, that kind of opportunity was rare. So where could Sega's ideas and games go? Going third party came with a cost. Sega didn't have control over the environment that their games lived in anymore. So now they had to design around other consoles' priorities. A new audience, other incentive structures, and new definitions of what success meant. Sega's output was loud, fast, mechanical, and pretty strange. And the early 2000s console market wasn't really optimized for that. Sony's platform incentives rewarded different kinds of games. Cinematic and prestige-driven experiences designed to justify the PlayStation 2 as a technological leap and to ensure it sold. Nintendo occupied an entirely different cultural lane, one Sega had historically struggled to coexist with both creatively and commercially. That left no viable homes, except for maybe one of them that already felt familiar. A known collaborator. Microsoft. Trust had already existed between these two companies. Philosophies overlapped, but most importantly, the tooling was already aligned. Just imagine, if you will, if Microsoft had a console. Developers from the Dreamcast could have a near one-to-one workflow, considering the Dreamcast was already utilizing a modified version of Windows CE. That would allow for an easy migration, and developers wouldn't have to relearn new tools and development kits. For displaced Dreamcast developers, this wasn't a massive leap, it was a linear move. The market had narrowed their options until Microsoft was the only place that made structural sense. In November 2001, 9 months after Sega announced they were leaving the console market, Microsoft launched the original Xbox. Just a bit of a preface here. When people hear spiritual successor, they imagine copy hardware, shared branding, or an official handoff. And that's just not what happened here. This wasn't about copying the Dreamcast or becoming a new Dreamcast. It was more about inheriting the role that Sega had left behind. Regardless of whether Sega had or hadn't left the console market, Microsoft would have still released the Xbox. It's just that everything aligned in a way that allowed Microsoft to inherit an ecosystem that had just lost its footing. There was a noticeable concentration of people and ideas that appeared on Xbox, not everyone mind you, but just enough to matter. In its first years, the Xbox library was showcasing sequels of Dreamcast exclusive titles, Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Crazy Taxi, and not ports, not remakes, but actual honest-to-God sequels. The Xbox was also the perfect environment for Sega to finally make use of internet connectivity, allowing for titles such as Phantasy Star Online Episodes 1 and 2, as well as Sega GT Online. Its developers found a place where they could continue expressing experimental ideas. As I stated earlier, the biggest factor for a smooth migration over to the Xbox's platform was how similar the workflow for development was. Xbox had the same PC-like architecture, utilized DirectX, had familiar APIs. Xbox wasn't really a new language for the developers. It was more like an accent for the same language. This ensured a near seamless transition, allowing those teams to continue at the development speeds they were used to. Sega's titles would go on to flourish in their new environment, and it made sense. There was an overlap in genre and design philosophy that felt natural. Both companies were arcade-forward and seemed to share a love for the experimental and weird. Xbox's library didn't feel like something that would be in PlayStation's future. It felt like the future Sega itself would have built. This migration was also beneficial to the consumer. If you were a fan of the Dreamcast, the Xbox didn't feel foreign. And in an era without constant online coverage, seeing those franchises continue on an entirely different console felt less like a coincidence and more like a continuation. Imagine being a fan of Jet Set Radio, for instance, thinking the franchise died when the Dreamcast did, and then seeing a sequel appear exclusively on the Xbox. Of course, there would be a bit of a whiplash, but afterwards you'd be like, hell yeah, brother. The console was gone, but what it represented wasn't. So, what does all this actually mean? What's the point here? Am I just giving you some weird early 2000s console trivia? Not really, no. This isn't really a story about Sega, and it's also not really a story about Microsoft. It's a story about how platforms work, a reframing to show you that there's more to a console than what you might think. When we think of consoles, we think of them competing with one another. Is this box of hardware better than this box? Comparing specs, brands fighting each other in the market. We relegate them down to machines, but consoles are more than that. They're living, breathing ecosystems. They're a collection of developers and their tools, audiences, and design philosophy, all existing within hardware that temporarily hosts them. When that hardware disappears, the ecosystem doesn't. It seeks a new place to thrive. Sega left the hardware business, and we never saw the Dreamcast physically make a return. There was never a Dreamcast 2, there was never an official handoff, no ceremony, no fanfare. But the role Sega played, the space it occupied in the console market, that didn't disappear. It shifted. The developers went where the tools felt familiar, the consumers sought recognizable ideas, and Microsoft, intentionally or not, was in a place where it absorbed that shift. We remember consoles as winners or losers. We even remember sales charts and marketing campaigns. Behind the curtain, though, something else happens. Roles are being filled, and spaces in the industry are constantly being reshaped. The Dreamcast didn't survive as hardware, no, but the role it played did. And the games it encouraged, the developers it empowered, and the fans it attracted, those all survived. They adapted, they relocated, and ultimately found a home in the original Xbox. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I enjoy diving into gaming archaeology, and it's something that I'd like to explore more in the future. Let me know in the comments below any thoughts you have about what I've said, and maybe give me a few ideas on what sort of topics you'd like to see in the future. I hope to see you in the next one.